During the summer between my 2 years of poetry school, I took to walking. Once I was clear of the neighborhood, I wandered along a road that cut through a tunnel of trees and into a park that lay on the banks of the Willamette River. There was something comforting about those trees. They held the wind in their moss-muffled branches, pushing back the distant grumble of traffic. Morning light filtered past pine needles through brilliant constellations of maple leaves and down into the ivy and ferns that carpeted either side of the path. Being held there, even for the brief minutes that I passed through that patch of forest, was to be held separate from the world. In one sense, I could no longer see nor hear the houses, the cars, the dogs, the lawns that were all a few short steps away. In another, though, this luminous green cocoon was so vastly different from the landscape. Yellow rows of papery cornstalks carved out beside wide-ranging grasslands beneath the crown of snow-stippled mountains that offered the only challenge to the uninterrupted and fathomless sky that I had grown up in. So the trees here, enveloping as they were also alien, and I could never shake the feeling that I had to walk with a stoop, shoulders curled in to avoid bumping into the trunks and branches that rushed in close from every side. There was never a moment of rest, never an empty space to place the eye, just leaves upon moss, as verdant and lovely as it was alien and stifling. With the park and its grove eventually behind me, I found myself once again in the geometry of the neighborhood. Straight fences, even lawns, rectangular flower beds, a sign warning dog owners away from the pesticide-free berry bushes near the curb. Feeling the weight of being misplaced, I made my way back to the rented townhouse I shared with 2 other people. I had seen enough of the valley's beauty for one day. But then the wind shifted, and my eye caught a shimmer that pulled my gaze up a white trunk and into a twinkling riot that I hadn't seen since leaving home, but that I recognized at once as the familiar dance of aspen leaves against a rare glimpse of blue sky. I watched those leaves twist and waver in the breeze for a moment, before straightening a little and continuing towards home. You may have heard writing authorities say that you should write what you know, and on the one hand, that's probably pretty good advice. It saves you from saying that there are no hummingbirds in the mountains, only to have your readers send you a picture of one a few days later. But on the other hand, it's good advice because so much of writing grows out of our experiences. That's especially true for poets and essayists, but even fiction writers draw on their experiences as they craft stories that never happened. The richness of life is the best raw material for good writing. However, there's a pitfall when it comes to writing what we know, especially when we put too much emphasis on the knowing. Sometimes we can tell our readers just what we want them to know, without ever letting them experience the poem or the story or the lesson. We live in a world that puts too much emphasis on what we know, on the intellect and on the mind, and that can have disastrous consequences. At least that's what David Abram argues in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous. In this book, Abram writes about the relationship between civilization and the environment, thought and language, our bodies and the bodies, human and otherwise, that surround us. And all of this grows out of his experiences learning with shamans and sorcerers in various different parts of the world. His central argument, rooted in his experiences but also in academic philosophy, is a plea for us to rethink our relationship with the planet and the organisms that share it with us. But it's what he has to say about language that I find particularly interesting. In fact, I read this book for the first time in college, in a writing class, and it fundamentally changed the way I think about writing and how it works, and that's what I like to share with you today. My focus is not really on all of the ecological implications of Abram's work. You can read it yourself if you're interested in that. But instead, I want to draw out the bits and pieces that are applicable to our own writing, the things that have become a foundation of my own approach and that I think can help to refine your own craft as well. Shall we? Much of Abram's argument draws on a branch of philosophy called phenomenology, especially the work of Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in whose words the mission of phenomenology is, respectively, to return to the things themselves, or to describe rather than explain or analyze. The idea is that knowledge begins with sensory perceptions and the body, and that might seem a little unusual if you've had experience with philosophy before. It's hard to get through life without hearing René Descartes' famous conclusion, "I think, therefore I am." For Descartes, the only thing he could know with absolute certainty was that he was thinking, And if he was thinking, then it was a natural consequence that he must exist. So, for Descartes, knowledge began with the fundamental fact of his existence as evidenced by his thinking. But for the phenomenologist, the basic truth is not that we think, but something else. As Abram puts it, without this body, without these tongue or these ears, you could neither speak nor hear another's voice. Nor could you have anything to speak about, or even to reflect on, or to think, since without any contact, any encounter, without any glimmer of sensory experience, there could be nothing to question or to know. The living body is thus the very possibility of contact, not just with others, but with oneself. The very possibility of reflection, of thought, of knowledge. The common notion of the experiencing self or mind as an immaterial phantom ultimately independent of the body can only be a mirage. Merleau-Ponty invites us to recognize at the heart of even our most abstract cogitations the sensuous and sentient life of the body itself. That is, even before we can think, we must perceive. Our first contact with the world is not through our brains, but through our eyes or ears, our fingertips, tongues, and noses. For example, I don't think that there is an aspen tree on the corner. I see it and hear it, and by perceiving it, I then know that it's there. And in large measure, such sensory experiences form the basis of anything and everything we could ever know. I know there is a robin in the tree outside because I can hear it. I know that I like ice cream because I can taste its sweetness and feel its freezing smoothness. And I know that I don't ever need to spend a night in a tent in the mountains again because the whole range of sensory experiences I enjoyed while younger taught me that it's just not for me. So our knowledge arises from our sensory experiences, but our judgments and evaluations do too. This is why we so often miss the point when we get into debates with people. They don't disagree with us because they lack knowledge, but because they've had different experiences that have led them to understand the world in different ways. The basic reality, though, is that there is no thought without sensory input, no judgment without an initial perception. So when we disagree with somebody about an issue, we might think we're just challenging their ideas, but it often amounts to a direct challenge to the experiences they've had that led to those judgments in the first place. But sensory perception is not just primary in a philosophical sense, it also came first historically. As Abrams explains, for much of our history, we lived in a way that was attuned to the natural landscape around us, something that he observes in indigenous cultures and that he even came to embody as he spent time around people who were attuned to the sensory landscape of the world. In fact, he describes his experience returning to North America like this. I was excited by the new sensibilities that had stirred in my newfound awareness of a more than human world, of the great potency of the land, and particularly of the keen intelligence of other animals, large and small, whose lives and culture interpenetrate our own. I startled neighbors by chattering with squirrels who swiftly climbed down the trunks of their trees and across lawns to banter with me, or by gazing for hours on end at a heron fishing in a nearby estuary, or at gulls opening clams by dropping them from a height onto the rocks along the beach. Yet very gradually, I began to lose my sense of the animal's own awareness. The gull's technique for breaking open the clams began to appear as a largely automatic behavior. I found myself now observing the heron from outside its world, no longer feeling its tense yet poised alertness with my own muscles. And, strangely, the suburban squirrels no longer responded to my chittering calls. As the expressive and sentient landscape slowly faded behind my more exclusively human concerns, threatening to become little more than an illusion or fantasy, I began to feel, particularly in my chest and abdomen, as though I were being cut off from vital sources of nourishment. Abram's experience illustrates the primary importance of the senses and of attunement to the world that discloses itself through those senses. We might think of it like this. Our thinking brains exist in our bodies. The reason that we cannot begin with thought as evidence that we exist is because we can't begin with thought at all. As Abram puts it, clearly a wholly immaterial mind could neither see things nor touch things. Indeed, could not experience anything at all. We can experience things, can touch, hear, and taste things only because as bodies, we are ourselves included in the sensible field and have our own textures, sounds, and tastes. That is, the only way to the brain is through the senses. The brain cannot access any information from the world without input from at least one of its sensory mechanisms. And of course, the brain can't communicate anything except through the body. We are not and cannot be pure intellects independent of our bodies. Without the foundation of sensory experience, the brain couldn't think even the single thought that would demonstrate its existence. But as Abram's experience also illustrates, it can be all too easy to lose our connection to the sensory world, to drift back into our purely human concerns, and to think mistakenly that we can and should lead our lives with just the mind alone. When Abram returned to North America, he returned to a culture not rooted in sensory perceptions of the natural world, but in abstract conceptual thought, something that he sees reflected in the omnipresence of human-made things in our largely artificial environments that separate us from that natural world. This separation from the natural world is a symptom, he argues, of the divide we've constructed between our bodily perceptions and our intellectual abstractions, a divide that he illustrates with the simple but dramatic scientific discovery that we are not at the center of the universe. He writes, after the investigations of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, the sun came to be conceived as the center of the phenomenal world. Yet this conception simply did not agree with our spontaneous sensory perception, which remained the experience of a radiant orb traversing the sky of a stable Earth. A profound schism was thus brought about between our intellectual convictions and the most basic conviction of our senses, between our mental concepts and our bodily percepts. Descartes' philosophical distinction of the mind from the body was surely prompted by this already existing state of affairs. It was necessary for the maintenance of the new Copernican worldview that the rational intellect hold itself apart from the experiencing body. Thus, science was, perhaps for the first time, telling us that what we perceived to be true was, in fact, wrong. Our senses told us the lie that the sun was traveling around the Earth, and science told us the truth that it was, in fact, us who were traveling around the sun. And then later, Descartes proposed that his intellect existed independent of his body, and that, in fact, his abstractly reasoning mind was the foundational fact of his existence. Of course, as Abram points out, our very words have continued to betray the intellect and to prevent the clean ascendancy of the Copernican system. We still say the sun rises and the sun sets, whether we are farmers or physicists. It is in this sense, writing from the perspective of the experiencing body, that Husserl is able to claim that Earth, the original ark, does not move. This isn't a refusal of scientific knowledge or a denial of the facts. Instead, it's a recognition that our technically incorrect perceptions can still be useful and functional in everyday ways for all of us who aren't involved in space travel. Science tells us that the sun does not rise or set, but of course it does, every single day. But to make a long story short, Abram traces an intellectual tradition that holds abstract conceptual thought in high regard and that dismisses sensory bodily experiences down to the present day. And of course, I can remember sitting in a science class in school and learning that human perceptions are unreliable, but that thanks to the methodologies and instruments of modern science, we can correct for the exuberances of sensory perception. As a result, then, we came to believe that truth resided in the mind and that we were better off disregarding the sensory data that came to us from our bodies. Then, as a consequence of that, we retreated further and further from the living world and deeper into our artificial environments. As Abrams writes, the super-straight lines and right angles of our office architecture, for instance, make our animal senses wither even as they support the abstract intellect. The wild, earth-born nature of the materials, the woods, clays, metals, and stones that went into the building, are readily forgotten behind the abstract and calculable form. Thus, caught up in a massive abstraction, our attention hypnotized by a host of human-made technologies that only reflect us back to ourselves, it is all too easy for us to forget our carnal inherence in a more-than-human matrix of sensations and sensibilities. Our bodies have formed themselves in delicate reciprocity with the manifold textures, sounds, and shapes of an animate earth. To shut ourselves off from these other voices, to continue by our lifestyles to condemn these other sensibilities to the oblivion of extinction, is to rob our own senses of their integrity and to rob our minds of their coherence. So, while we are capable of abstract thought, and while we have enjoyed many advances thanks to intellectual endeavors, when we think that truth resides in abstractions and that we are somehow separate from nature because of our rational intellects, we rob ourselves of the coherence that is grounded in sensory experience, and we forget that perception always precedes knowledge. For Abram, this split between the intellect and the body has led to disastrous environmental consequences. And for our purposes today, it has also precipitated a lot of bad writing. While Abram describes the institutionalization of abstract thought through certain philosophical and scientific traditions, he cites the evolution of language, particularly the evolution of written language, as a primary cause for this separation between the body and the mind. For ages, Abram writes, humans communicated only through spoken language, and even still, infants learn a language not by principle, but through the bodily experience of absorbing and imitating the local sounds and rhythms of the language around them. But then something changed. We learned how to write. And that might not sound like very much of a big deal, but Abram illustrates the consequences of that by tracing the development of a single character from its origin to the present day. Originally, he explains, the letter Aleph looked like this. Not coincidentally, the word Aleph, which referred to the character, also referred to an ox. The letter was named for the creature it was modeled after. But time passed, and like all great logos, Aleph became simplified. In Phoenician, it looked like this. And then, when the same character had found its way into the Greek language, it was looking far more familiar to us, but also much less like an ox. And of course, its Greek name, Alpha, only referred to the letter and not to an animal. For Abram, this evolution of the letter form brought us into a completely new relationship with our thoughts, with ourselves, and with the world. For the first time, the Greeks had an alphabet that was completely abstracted from sensory experiences. Alpha was not a depiction of an ox, it was just an arbitrary sign for a particular vowel sound. And for the first time, readers of a language were not seeing the familiar shapes of the world in what they read. Instead, they were seeing arbitrary and abstracted representations of their own thoughts and words reflected back at them. As a result, Abram argues, we began to see ourselves as separate from the natural world and to regard our knowledge and ideas as belonging to some kind of idealized realm independent from our bodily senses. Of course, Abram spends more time developing the argument than I will here, but the basic idea is that as language became more abstracted from the sensory phenomena that it initially imitated, we became more and more invested in abstract thought and began to see ourselves increasingly apart from the sensory world. This has led us to a critical mistake that writers make all the time: the mistake of writing only in abstractions. Let me explain with this example. Let's imagine that I'm walking down the street and that I can see an aspen in somebody's yard. I know it's there because of information that my eyes have sent to my brain, and even as I perceive that tree, inseparable from the perception itself, I experience a sense of familiarity, maybe even a fleeting sense of feeling at home. Now imagine that I want to tell you about that experience so that you understand what it feels like to feel at home for just a moment in a setting where you otherwise feel out of place. The most efficient thing to do would be just to transmit the moral of the story that I abstracted from my experience directly to you. I had the experience, made the judgment, and now I can just impart it. But remember, there is no direct access hatch to the brain. The brain cannot receive abstract thoughts because the brain is only connected to the world through the senses. It's designed to receive sensory input, not conceptual input. And yeah, I can use the written language loophole and just put my abstract thought in writing so that you can see it, read it, and understand it. But this is a strategy that short-circuits the basic system of perception and cognition. It's a hack, an attempt to get directly to the brain by bypassing the senses as much as possible. But tell me, how likely are you to be interested in, much less moved by, a sentence that says, "One time I was feeling a little out of place, and then I saw a tree that I liked growing up, and it made me feel a little better"? You might say, "Hey, cool," and you could even relate to it. But you probably wouldn't be that invested in it, and I'm willing to bet that you'd forget about it before too long. And Abram offers an explanation for why such an approach wouldn't be that effective. The sensuous, breathing body is, as we have seen, a dynamic, ever-unfolding form, more a process than a fixed or unchanging object. As such, it cannot readily appropriate inert facts or data, static nuggets of information, abstracted from the lived situations in which they arise. Yet the living body can easily assimilate other dynamic or eventful processes, like the unfolding of a story, appropriating each episode or event as a variation of its own unfolding. And the more lively the story, the more vital or stirring the encounters within it, the more readily it will be incorporated. That is, our brains are not designed to receive and assimilate abstracted ideas and concepts. Instead, they're set up to receive stories, experiences, sensory data that then forms the raw material from which abstract ideas are generated. That's why my math teacher taught us to sing the quadratic equation to the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. It's why ancient orators memorized their speeches by placing different sections in various rooms of their mind palaces. And it's why I choose to explain certain principles of rhetorical persuasion in terms of making a grilled cheese sandwich. Abstractions are slippery. We don't have nerve endings anywhere that can detect abstractions and move them to the brain, so we use things like tunes, memory palaces, and metaphors to attach abstract concepts to experiences so that our brains can more readily hold on to and process them. This is also why novelists describe characters and settings, and why poets never cease to frustrate people by failing to get to the point. But of course, the point is not the abstract reduction of the experience. The point is the experience itself. The goal is not to tell readers what you know, but to recreate an experience for them so that they know it too, as if by their own experience. That is, this book led me to realize that the most effective kind of writing is the kind of writing that acknowledges that our readers live in sensing, perceiving bodies. Rather than willing my readers to absorb abstract concepts, I look for ways to engage their senses as much as possible. Obviously, there's more outright room for that in poetry than in academic writing, but even then, it's possible to write in a lively, personable style rather than a dull and merely informational one. Because we're generally brought up in a world that teaches us to separate our bodies from our intellects and to distrust our perceptions, if not ignore them outright, we tend to think that the best and most efficient way to write is by leading with abstractions. So we aim to communicate our ideas rather than our experiences, but it's a strategy that works to our collective detriment. One of the most common comments that I leave on the work of new creative writers is something along the lines of, "This is a really interesting piece, but it kind of feels like I'm reading about the story more than reading the actual story. I get to hear about what happened, but I don't really get to experience it." And the same goes for essays and poems too. As a consequence of the world that they've grown up in that has taught them to lead with abstractions, new writers generally can't help but write stories, poems, and essays that feel more like summaries of the pieces that they could be writing, that all lack the lively, vivid experiences that their readers are actually looking for. As Abram puts it, there are good stories and mediocre stories and downright bad stories. How are they to be judged? The answer is this: a story must be judged according to whether it makes sense. And making sense must here be understood in its most direct meaning. To make sense is to enliven the senses. To make sense is to release the body from the constraints imposed by outworn ways of speaking, and hence to renew and rejuvenate one's felt awareness of the world. It is to make the senses wake up to where they are. That is the measure of a good story, certainly the measure of a good poem, but it can be the measure of a good research paper too. It's the kind of writing that engages the senses, wakes up the body, and puts reader and writer into meaningful contact with each other, not as disembodied intellects, but as living, breathing human beings. So, even though this book is not explicitly a handbook for writers, Abram's insights have been foundational in forming the way that I think about writing. By recognizing that my readers have sensing bodies and not just intellectual brains, and that sensory experiences are more delightful, engaging, and memorable than bare concepts, I've come to approach writing in a whole different way. Now, when I'm writing a poem or thinking through an essay or even planning a lesson, I don't just ask myself what I want to say. Instead, I ask myself what kind of an experience I want to create for my audience. What kinds of experiences will bring them into the piece and then send them on their way, glad that they spent the time the way they did. And of course, that's a question that requires ongoing attention and adjustment. At any rate, though, and I hope we can agree, I'm glad that you've chosen to spend this time with me now. To conclude, Abram argues that the development of the written word and abstract thought has led us and our planet to a pretty dismal state. But he says that the cure is not to reject the written word completely, but instead to approach it differently, more responsibly, less intellectually, and more humanely. For those of us who care for an Earth not encompassed by machines, a world of textures, tastes, and sounds other than those that we have engineered, there can be no question of simply abandoning literacy, of turning away from all writing. Our task, rather, is that of taking up the written word with all of its potency and patiently, carefully, writing language back into the land. Our craft is that of releasing the budded earthly intelligence of our words, freeing them to respond to the speech of the things themselves, to the green uttering forth of leaves from the spring branches. It is the practice of spinning stories that have the rhythm and lilt of the local soundscape, tales for the tongue, tales that want to be told again and again, sliding off the digital screen and slipping off the lettered page to inhabit these coastal forests, those desert canyons, those whispering grasslands and valleys and swamps, finding phrases that place us in contact with the trembling neck muscles of a deer holding its antlers high as it swims toward the mainland, or with the ant dragging a scavenged rice grain through the grasses, planting words like seeds under rocks and fallen logs, letting language take root once again in the earthen silence of shadow and bone and leaf.